Hi y'all, Rebecca Michael here, back with another video, and this one's on comorbidity and abuse excuses. The point I want to make here is that mental health issues, for example, bipolar, it's treated through medication, or childhood trauma, these are often used as abuse excuses by those that are also comorbid with on the narcissism or antisocial personality disorders spectrum, moderate to severe. And so they'll have abuse issues going on. And that's what I want to discuss. If there's comorbidity going on between, say, narcissism traits that you notice, I'll get into that in a bit, and another disorder or other problems such as childhood trauma or mental health disorders. These are treated completely differently. These are completely separate issues and completely different treatment modalities. So they often go undiagnosed, and they'll use their disorder, mental health disorder, or their childhood trauma, for example, with targets to keep a target in the relationship a lot longer than you should be in it. So because of the abuse, because they're actually comorbid and not diagnosed with narcissistic traits or antisocial personality disorder traits such as psychopathy, sociopathy, criminality, etc. These are all separate issues, entirely separate issues from mental health, for example, mental health disorders that are treated with medications and other forms of therapy. The criminality is no different among the general population or the mental health population. It's the same, pretty much the same percentage. Yeah, very, very, very slim. So if you see that, well, we'll get into that in a minute. So the definition of comorbidity here, what I'm talking about is, for example, a DSM Axis 1 disorder diagnosis such as bipolar or childhood trauma, along with cluster B disorder type of traits such as narcissism, antisocial personality disorder, and borderline personality disorder, although borderline is separate because they're normally more about self-harm and emotional dysregulation. So I'm not including that too much into the abuse spectrum, but narcissism traits for sure, and antisocial personality disorder, if they have these traits moderate to severe, regardless of whether or not they're stable with their, for example, if they have bipolar, if they're stable and they still have these traits, but maybe in a more passive aggressive way, or if they're in a depressed state, this is all abuse. So that's a completely separate issue from the bipolar, but they're rarely diagnosed. And so this can keep us in the relationship a long time because of our empathy and our conscience, So anyway, as I've mentioned before, the cluster B disorders such as narcissism, these are the abusive ones, and antisocial personality disorder, these traits are all abusive. They're often court-ordered. They're often not diagnosed. So only if court-ordered did often people even are diagnosed with that. So it slips under the radar. And they can be using their other diagnosis, for example, bipolar or childhood trauma, as excuses for their abuse. So there's a spectrum of severity on the narcissism traits and the ASPD, or antisocial personality disorder, which I'll be getting into. Bipolar disorder, for example, is often diagnosed with BPD or borderline personality disorder. But like I said, borderline personality disorder, it's that they're more about self-harm. They're not so much about abuse as self-harm, but they do also have the 3-stage cycle that's common to the cluster B disorders. Includes narcissism, psychopathy, which would be the ones I talked about: idealization, devalue, discard. That's a repetitive cycle that they can go through targets. So this is mostly about narcissism and ASPD to do with abuse, is what I'm saying. So with bipolar, for example, when they're actively psychotic, they can have signs of NPD, such as the entitlement, the grandiosity, the delusions of grandeur, the persecution, delusions of persecution, impulsivity, in the manic phase only. See, with medications and therapy, once they come down to normal or even depressed, that shouldn't be there anymore, even in a passive aggressive way, such as abuse like silent treatment, stonewalling, things like this. This will continue to go on if they also have moderate to high narcissistic traits, no matter what their stability of their mood is. So these are abusive people. On top, they have an abuse issue chronically. You can tell by their track record of abuse targets, their casualties. Okay, you can tell that, and in other ways, that this isn't just the mania or when they're unstable. This is even when they're stable. So when they're in a normal, stable interval. So they often go diagnosed, like I said, unless it's court ordered. They slip under the radar with the abuse issue. The abuse issue is entirely separate. That's what I'm getting at here. And the treatment method for it is focused on accountability and their core beliefs, which tend to be misogynist and abusive. Also, their abuse cycle of idealize, devalue, discard targets, for example. And these issues of mental illness, as I've described, or childhood trauma, for example, the treatment methods are completely different and opposite to do with abuse treatment. Treatment programs for abuse hold you accountable and examine your own core beliefs that you feel entitled to abuse and use people. So the symptoms won't go away when, for example, if it's bipolar mania, the abuse doesn't go away, just maybe goes underground under the radar, but it's still called abusive control or abusive covert abuse. So comorbidity would mean, for example, if you're talking about bipolar, I've known bipolar people that are not abusive, and they don't have the track record, for example, that others do, that use this as an excuse because they've actually got an abuse problem as well, because they have elevated narcissistic traits to the point of abuse, which is what's going to happen there, or even ASPD. So when the bipolar when there's elevated NARC and ASPD traits, for example, they're still present regardless of the mood level. So there's still abuse going on. It just may be under the radar. It's now coercive abuse, passive aggressive. So even when stable, you'll see the entitlement. These are all NARC traits. Okay, you'll see the entitlement, grandiosity, the blame shifting, the pathological envy and lying. You'll see the pathological lying, the various manipulative tactics they use, and I'll do another video on that. Scheming, using manipulative tactics to control others and abuse them, because this gives them a sense of power, to deceive and abuse others. So you'll also see the 3 to 4 stages of the abuse Kanban cycle, which I discussed in a previous video called Kanban Cycle Love Scams. That'll be present. And that is a hallmark of narc abuse and ASPD, or antisocial personality disorder. So you could say the same for childhood trauma. It's no excuse for abuse. This is what I'm saying. Mental illness that is treatable, and childhood trauma does not take your will, your free will and choices away when you're stable. That's what I'm getting at. So those who show comorbidity traits with NPD, ASPD, etc. know right from wrong. But they just don't care, and they don't learn from bad consequences. They just keep repeating the abuse cycle. They lack emotional empathy, but not cognitive empathy, so they can cold read us in order to manipulate and form dominance bonds as a result with us. These are not true bonds. That's what we think we're getting into, but it isn't. The bond, the true bonds that's coming from us, the true love with the empathy and the conscience, is one way. They don't have that. They're trying to power us down. That's what the abuse is about. Okay, so the main point here is, regardless of mental illness disorders such as bipolar or childhood trauma issues, the treatment for chronic habitual abuse is entirely separate and treated with accountability and examining their core beliefs that they feel entitled to abuse others and cross boundaries and break deal breakers, break laws, break contracts, etc. So without this treatment for abuse, there's no insight with them. And those moderate to higher on the spectrum of, say, narc traits or ASPD traits will repeat this cycle by just changing targets, locales, schemes, manipulative tactics, and personas in order to ensnare targets. And I'll get into this personas in a different video. So what needs to happen here is targets need to get in the know. They need to go low to no contact. If you see narc traits, habitual narc traits, regardless of diagnosis of other mental illness or childhood trauma. If you see the traits, the narc traits I talked about, entitlement rage, envy, pathological lying, the chronic use of manipulative tactics of various kinds to control and deceive and use and abuse. If you see this chronically in their timeline and with yourself, you need to go low to no contact. They need treatment for the abuse specifically, aside from whatever treatment they're getting for anything else is the point. And you will see results in that they will be making amends to all they have abused in their track record. They will no longer be abusing or discarding or devaluing anyone. That's like, they will have insight, and they will, through their willpower, decide, I don't want to do that anymore. So you'll also see amends and restitution for real, not just talk or more manipulation or more mirroring you with a persona that they think you're going to accept, etc. That's all manipulation. That's not change. That's not real change. So the reality is there's a very poor abuse treatment prognosis. 1% is what I've seen from an abuse expert. For example, Lundy Bancroft, who is an abuse expert in domestic violence and abuse. So only 1% usually follow through. It's a high fail rate. The reason why is because they want power and dominance over others, and they like their disorder because it makes them feel superior to others. That's the duper's delight. The lying, the pathological lying, they feel like they know something you don't type of thing. They also like using and abusing others. So it's, once again, it's the path of least resistance of lie, cheat, steal. Why work for it? Why do the sustained effort the rest of us have to do? So that's all the abuse route right there. So it's the easy path of least resistance, and it's the fastest way to self-benefits. This is why they do it. They also lack emotional empathy, and so they don't care. They don't have the capacity to care without emotional empathy, although they do have, like I said, cognitive empathy in order to be able to deceive, suss out your vulnerabilities, and manipulate you. But that's all self-serving, and none of it is other-centered. So they don't have emotional empathy. They have the ability to cold read, that's it, in order to manipulate us. So you may see them make small behavioral changes, but the callousness and the lack of conscience and the lack of remorse, they're still going to be present. You're still going to see the blame shifting and the scapegoating on others, and the abuse, the active abuse, they'll always be actively abusing someone. So through the blame shifting. And that'll still be present, and the reason why is it eventually becomes hardwired into the brain, so it's now pathological and it's not going to change, or it's highly resistant to change. It's on autopilot, that abuse cycle, and that Kanban, 3-stage Kanban, idealize, devalue, discard, it's just on autopilot. And that's an abusive cycle. So hence, low to no contact is always recommended by the experts or by targets, recovering targets. That's the only thing that works. And in order to protect yourself and your loved ones, because these abuse across the board. There's no exceptions once they get close to anybody. So emotional detachment is very important, because they're emotional predators and manipulators through our emotions, through our empathy, our caring, and our conscience. They keep us in the cycle by breadcrumbing us with love dosing here and there, stringing you along, that kind of thing. And then when they're done with you, they just discard you, shelve you, and they may get back to you and recycle you. Probably not if you're doing what I'm doing and exposing them from a safe distance, but otherwise, no, they'll probably be back. Anyway, thanks for listening. Ciao for now, Phoenix.